Welcome, my dear friend. Let everything slow. In the lands between, before it was the broken and golden ruin that the Tarnished walks through, there were the demigods, the children of Queen Marika, born to the various consorts and unions that the Queen's long reign had produced, each of them carrying a portion of her divinity and a portion of whatever the other parent had brought to the joining. They were not gods, they were not mortals, they were the things that exist in the space between, powerful beyond the measure of ordinary beings and bound by the particular fates that their parentage and their place in the Golden Order had arranged for them. Among them was Radahn, the Red Lion General, the mightiest hero the demigods produced, by the assessment that the lands between itself recorded in the texts and the songs that survived the Shattering. The warrior who would one day hold the stars in the sky through the force of his own will, who would be feared as the strongest of all the demigods during the war that broke the world, who would be reduced by the end of his story to something that the people who loved him could only free through death. Tonight we begin at the beginning, with his blood and his parentage and the lands that were his, before the rot and the stars and the long humiliation that the Shattering would visit upon him. The blood of two powers. Radahn was the son of Radagon and Renala. Both names carry weight in the lore of the lands between, and the weight is worth sitting with, because Radahn's nature was the product of the joining of two of the most significant figures the Golden Order produced. Renala was the Queen of the Full Moon, the head of the Curian royal family and the Academy of Raya Lucaria, the most accomplished sorceress of her age and the ruler of a tradition of glintstone magic that drew its power from the moon and the stars, rather than from the Erdtree's golden grace. The Carians were not part of the Golden Order in the way that the rest of the lands between was part of it. They had their own traditions, their own relationship to the cosmos, their own magic that looked upward at the night sky, rather than toward the Erdtree's light. Radagon was something more complicated, in ways that the lore reveals slowly, and that the people living inside the story did not understand at the time. He was a champion, a red-haired warrior of enormous capability, who had come to the Carian royal family and married Renala and fathered her children before leaving her to join Queen Marika in the capital. The full truth of who Radagon was is one of the great revelations of Elden Ring's lore, and it is not the subject of tonight's telling. What matters for Radahn is that his father was a being of immense power and immense significance, whose abandonment of Renala broke the Carian Queen in ways that the Academy never recovered from. Radahn inherited his father's hair, the furious, flaming red hair of Radagon, which Radahn wore with pride and which he understood as a heroic inheritance. The Redmane helm that he wore into battle was the helm of the Golden Lion with flowing red hair, and the lore preserves Radahn's own relationship to this inheritance in a line that captures something essential about him. I was born a champion's cub. Now I am the lord of the battlefield's lion. The line is worth examining slowly, because it tells us how Radahn understood himself. A champion's cub, the child of a great warrior, born into the inheritance of martial greatness, aware from the beginning that he came from someone whose valor had been legendary. The lord of the battlefield's lion. What the cub had grown into, the realization of the inheritance, the transformation of the potential that the bloodline carried into the achieved fact of one of the greatest warriors the lands between had ever produced. He aspired to be a general. Radagon's great power as a warrior would have attracted Radahn, who looked at his father's legend and wanted to build his own in the same register. Not the register of sorcery, though he had the Carian blood that gave him access to the glintstone traditions. the register of the battlefield, of the army, of the general who leads from the front, and whose name becomes the name his soldiers fight under. The Carian inheritance and the choice. Radahn was born with access to two traditions. From his mother, the Carian glintstone sorcery, the magic of the moon and the stars, and the academy of Raya Lucaria. From his father, the martial inheritance, the warrior's path that Radagon's legend embodied. Most beings would have to choose between such inheritances, because the disciplines they represent require different kinds of dedication and different orientations toward the world. The scholar of glintstone sorcery spends years in the academy, mastering the intricate theory and practice of a magical tradition that rewards patience and study. The warrior spends those same years developing the body and the combat instincts and the tactical understanding that the battlefield rewards. The two paths diverge early, and the divergence tends to be permanent. Radahn did not entirely choose. This is one of the things that made him exceptional rather than merely powerful. He took the martial path, became the general he aspired to be, built the army that would carry his name, but he also retained and developed his relationship to the Carian magical tradition in a specific and unusual form that would become the defining feature of his legend. He did not become a sorcerer in the academy sense. He became something that the academy had not quite produced before, a warrior who wielded a particular branch of glintstone sorcery as an extension of his martial power, rather than as an alternative to it. The branch was gravity. Of all the magical traditions available to someone with Carian blood, Radahn pursued the sorceries that manipulated gravitational force, and he pursued them for reasons that the lore preserves, and that are stranger and more touching than the cosmic scale of his eventual achievements would suggest. We will come to those reasons. What matters here is that the choice to develop gravity magic was the choice that distinguished Radahn from every other warrior and every other sorcerer in the lands between. He was not the most powerful warrior who also happened to know some magic, and he was not the most powerful sorcerer who also happened to fight. He was the unique combination, the general whose specific magical specialization became the thing his entire legend was built around. Caelid, before. The lands that were Radahn's were the lands of Caelid, in the present tense of Elden Ring. When the Tarnished arrives there, Caelid is a horror, a red wasteland of scarlet rot, where the ground is diseased and the creatures are twisted, and the sky itself carries the sickly red tint of a region that has been poisoned to its foundations. The Tarnished who walks through Caelid in the game encounters one of the most hostile environments the lands between contains, and the hostility is so complete that it is difficult to imagine the region as anything other than what it has become. But Caelid was not always this. Before the scarlet rot, before the war that brought the rot to the region, Caelid was a verdant land, the seat of Radahn's power, the territory that the Red Lion General governed and protected, the home of the Redmanes, and the place where the festival of war would one day be held. Redmane Castle stood in Caelid as the fortress of Radahn's army, and the lands around it were the lands of a thriving demigod's domain, rather than the diseased ruin that the rot would make of them. The transformation of Caelid from a verdant land into a rotting wasteland is one of the central tragedies of Radahn's story, and it is connected to the battle that would define and destroy him. But that battle is several parts away. For now, in the early period of Radahn's life and power, Caelid was green, and the Redmanes rode across it under the banner of the red-maned lion, and the general who governed it was building the legend that the songs would carry. He was admired. This is a detail that the lore is careful to preserve because it complicates the image of Radahn that his eventual boss fight might suggest. Radahn was not a tyrant or a monster in the period of his power. He was noted to be kind, admired by many for his noble qualities, a caring leader to his personal army. The soldiers who followed him followed someone who valued them, who led them with the combination of strength and care that produces genuine loyalty rather than mere obedience. The Red Lion General was beloved, and the love was earned by the qualities he displayed across the years of his rule. This matters for everything that comes after. The story of Radahn is not the story of a powerful villain brought low. It is the story of a beloved and noble figure whose strength and kindness became, through the machinery of fate and war and the schemes of others, the instruments of his own long degradation. The kinder and more admired Radahn was in the period of his power. The more the later parts of his story carry the weight of what was lost. The brothers and sisters. Radahn did not exist alone among the demigods. He was one of Marika's descendants, connected through the complicated genealogy of the Golden Order to the other children whose fates would intertwine with his across the Shattering and beyond. His half-siblings, through the Carrion line, the children of Rennala, included Ranni, the witch whose own arc would one day require Radahn's defeat, whose path to her particular destiny ran straight through the thing Radahn had done to the stars. Ranni and Radahn shared the Carrion blood, the inheritance from Rennala, the connection to the moon and the stars that the Carrion tradition carried. That the conquest of the stars by one of them would become the obstacle to the destiny of the other is one of the structural ironies of the lore, and it was not visible in the early period when they were no more than two of Rennala's children. The broader family of Marika's descendants included figures whose names carry their own weight in the lands between. Godwyn the Golden, the first of the demigods to die. Morgoth and Mog, the Omen twins. Malenia and Miquella, the cursed Empyrean and her brother. Rykard, who would seek his own dark path. Each of them carried a portion of the divine inheritance, and each of them would play a part in the catastrophe that the Shattering became. Radahn's place among them was the place of the warrior. When the demigods are ranked by the qualities they embodied, Radahn is the martial one, the general, the strongest in the specific register of battlefield power. Other demigods had other strengths. Ranni's cunning, Miquella's charm, Malenia's terrible resilience. Radahn's was the strength of arms, the power of the warrior who could not be defeated in open battle by any force the lands between could field against him. One bond among the siblings mattered more than the others for what would come, though it would not become visible until much later. Miquella, the young Empyrean, the brother whose own nature was bound up with charm and compassion and a vision of a gentler world, looked at Radahn and saw something he wanted. Not in the early period, perhaps, when they were both children of the same vast family, but across the years, Miquella came to admire Radahn for his kindness and his strength, seeing in him the qualities of a lord since childhood. The admiration of one demigod for another is not a small thing, and Miquella's admiration for Radahn would become, much later, the engine of the strangest and most tragic chapter of Radahn's entire story. The seeds of it were planted here, in the period when the brothers were nothing more than siblings, and one of them was the strongest warrior the family had produced, and the other was watching. What it meant to be a demigod. A word about the nature of the beings we are discussing, because the scale of Radahn's eventual achievements only makes sense in the context of what a demigod was. The demigods of the lands between were not powerful mortals. They were the descendants of a god, carrying within them a portion of Queen Marika's divinity, and the divinity expressed itself in capabilities that ordinary beings did not possess. They did not age as mortals aged. They did not die as mortals died in the ordinary course of things, which is why the death of Godwyn the Golden during the Night of the Black Knives was such a catastrophe. The death of a demigod was not supposed to be possible, and the form that Godwyn's death took broke rules that the lands between had assumed were unbreakable. A demigod's power was a function of their portion of the Elden Ring, the great rune that organized the reality of the lands between, and that the demigods would one day shatter and divide among themselves. Before the shattering, the demigods drew their authority from the intact order and from their place within it. Each of them was a force in the world, capable of things that shaped the lands around them, governing territories and commanding armies and embodying the various principles that the Golden Order distributed among Marika's children. Radahn, as the strongest of them in martial terms, was a force that the lands between organized itself around. His army was not just an army. It was the instrument of a demigod's will, carrying the power of one of Marika's children across the territory he governed. When the songs called him the mightiest hero of the demigods, the word hero was doing specific work, not the strongest soldier, not the most accomplished general in a merely human sense, but the demigod whose particular divine inheritance expressed itself as the supreme capability for war. This is the being who would, in time, turn his power against the sky itself. A mortal warrior, however skilled, could not have done what Radahn did to the stars. It required the demigod's portion of divine power, channeled through the specific magical discipline that Radahn had chosen to master, applied at a scale that only a being of his nature could reach. The conquest of the stars was not a feat of skill alone. It was the expression of what a demigod at the height of his power could do when his power was directed at the cosmos. This was true across the Shattering, when the demigods made war on each other for the shards of the Elden Ring. Radahn was feared as the strongest. No army could break him. No demigod could defeat him in the kind of battle that demigods fought. The Red Lion General stood at the top of the martial hierarchy of the lands between, and the only thing that would bring him down was not strength but disease, delivered by the one sibling whose particular nature made her capable of it. But that is a later part. For now, the champion's cub had become the lord of the battlefield's lion, and his red hair burned, and Caelid was green, and the stars still moved in the sky the way the stars had always moved. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the young general travels to Sellia and learns the magic that will define him, for a reason far smaller and far gentler than the scale of what it would let him do. The most powerful thing about Radahn's story is not the scale of what he did in the end. It is the smallness of why he learned to do it. Radahn became the warrior who held the stars in the sky. He mastered a school of magic so thoroughly that he could challenge the constellations themselves and win, freezing the heavens in place through the force of his gravitational will. This is one of the largest feats that any being in the lands between ever accomplished, a cosmic act that rearranged the relationship between the world and the sky. And the reason he set out to learn the magic that made it possible was that he did not want to abandon his horse. Tonight we go to Sellia, where the young general studied, and we sit with the gentleness at the root of the terrible power. The town of sorcery. Sellia was a town in Caelid, in the lands that would become Radahn's domain, known as a seat of glintstone sorcery, distinct from the great academy of Raya Lucaria. Where Raya Lucaria was the formal institution of Carian magical learning. The Grand Academy with its towers and its scholars and its rigid traditions. Sellia was something different. A town of sorcery with its own character, its own practitioners, its own branch of the magical arts that the broader Carian tradition encompassed. The young Radahn went to Sellia to study. This was the period of his youth, before the general had become the legend, when the champion's cub was still acquiring the capabilities that would define what he became. He could have gone to Raya Lucaria, the institution of his mother's tradition, the obvious place for a child of Renala to study sorcery. He went to Sellia instead, and what he studied there was the branch of magic that Raya Lucaria did not specialize in, the sorceries of gravity. His master was an alabaster lord. The lore preserves this detail in the text of the Gravity Well sorcery. The master who taught Radahn the gravity sorceries was an alabaster lord with skin of stone. The alabaster lords were beings associated with the fallen stars, the meteoric entities that came down from the sky and brought with them the gravitational magic that Sellia studied. They had skin of stone, a bodily nature that connected them to the celestial rocks whose fall had brought their kind to the lands between. One of them taught the young Radahn, and through that teaching Radahn acquired the discipline that would become the foundation of his legend. The gravity sorceries were not the glintstone magic of the Academy. They were a distinct tradition, connected to the stars and the meteors and the gravitational forces that governed the movement of celestial bodies. To study gravity was to study the force that held the cosmos together and the force that pulled the fallen stars down to the earth. It was, in a sense, that Radahn could not have understood when he began, the study of the very power he would one day turn against the sky itself. Leonard. Here we come to the heart of it. Radahn was an enormous being. The lore and the boss fight both establish his scale. He was massive, a giant among the demigods, a warrior whose physical size matched the magnitude of his martial reputation. A being of Radahn's size presented a specific and mundane problem, the kind of problem that the cosmic scale of his legend tends to obscure. He needed a mount that could carry him, and the mount that he loved was not a mount built for the task. His horse was named Leonard, and Leonard was, in the lore's own affectionate description, scrawny, a beloved but scrawny steed, not a great war horse bred to carry a giant into battle, not a mount whose physical capabilities matched the enormous warrior who rode it, a scrawny horse that Radahn loved, that was too small for him, that could not have carried a being of his size through the rigors of a demigod's warfare without being crushed by the simple physics of the weight it was being asked to bear. Radahn would not abandon Leonard. This is the detail that the lore preserves with care, because it tells us something essential about who Radahn was beneath the martial legend. He could have acquired a larger mount, a warrior of his stature, a demigod of his power, could have had any horse in the lands between, could have found or bred a steed whose size matched his own. The practical solution to the problem of a giant who needs to ride was a bigger horse. Radahn's solution was different. Rather than abandon the scrawny horse he loved, he learned to manipulate gravity. He mastered the gravitational sorceries of Sellia so that he could reduce his own weight, lighten the burden on Leonard, make it possible for the small beloved horse to carry the giant warrior without being crushed. The remembrance of the Starscourge preserves the reason. The Red Lion General wielded gravitational powers which he learned in Sellia during his younger days, all so he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed. Sit with this for a moment, because it is the most important thing about Radahn. The warrior who would conquer the stars, learned his power so that he would not have to give up his horse. The cosmic feat that defined his legend grew from a refusal to abandon something small that he loved. He did not set out to challenge the heavens. He set out to keep riding Leonard. The challenging of the heavens was what the power he developed for Leonard's sake turned out to be capable of, when the threat came that required it. This is the gentleness at the root of the terrible power. Radahn was kind. The law establishes this again and again. He was noble, admired, a caring leader. And the kindness was not separate from the power. The kindness was the origin of the power. He became strong enough to hold the stars because he loved the horse too much to ride a different one. What gravity magic was. The gravity sorceries that Radahn mastered were among the more distinctive magical traditions of the lands between, and understanding what they did helps to understand both the Leonard solution and the eventual conquest of the stars. Gravity magic manipulated the force of gravity itself. In its basic applications, it allowed the caster to pull objects and enemies toward themselves, to fire gravitational projectiles that dragged whatever they struck into the caster's reach, to manipulate the weight and the pull of physical things. The collapsing star's sorcery fired numerous gravitational projectiles, and any foes struck would be pulled toward the caster. The gravity well technique that Radahn studied under the Alabaster Lord was a gravitational discipline that the young general mastered as part of his training. Applied to Leonard, the magic served the gentle purpose of weight reduction. Radahn could lighten himself, could reduce the gravitational burden that his massive body placed on his beloved horse, could make the impossible pairing of giant and scrawny steed into a workable reality through the manipulation of the force that determined how heavy he was. Applied to the battlefield, the same magic became a weapon of devastating power. A warrior who could manipulate gravity could pull his enemies toward him, could crush them with increased weight, could control the movement of forces across the field of battle through the application of gravitational force. Radahn's gravity magic made him not just a giant with a sword, but a giant who could reach across distance and drag his enemies into range, who could manipulate the physics of the battlefield in ways that ordinary warriors could not counter. And applied to the sky, the same magic became the thing that conquered the stars, the force that reduced Radahn's weight for Leonard's sake, that pulled his enemies toward him on the battlefield, was the force that governed the movement of celestial bodies. Gravity holds the cosmos together. Gravity moves the stars. A being who mastered gravity to a sufficient degree, at the scale that a demigod's power allowed, could turn that mastery against the heavens themselves. The same discipline served all three purposes: the horse, the battlefield, the stars. From the smallest and gentlest reason grew the most cosmic and terrible achievement, because the magic that did the small gentle thing was the magic that, scaled up, did the cosmic terrible thing. The Alabaster Lords and what fell from the sky. The master who taught Radahn deserves more attention, because the nature of the teacher illuminates the nature of what was taught and foreshadows the threat that would make Radahn the Starscourge. The Alabaster Lords were beings of stone, their skin the pale stone-like substance that gave them their name, and their connection to the gravity sorceries was not incidental. They had come from the sky. The Alabaster Lords were associated with the fallen stars, the meteoric bodies that descended from the heavens and embedded themselves in the earth of the lands between. The gravitational magic they carried was the magic of the things that fall, the discipline of the force that pulls celestial bodies down from the sky to the ground. This connects the gravity sorceries to the larger cosmic situation that Radahn's legend was built around. The sky of the lands between was not a peaceful sky. Stars fell from it, and when stars fell, they did not fall as harmless lights. They brought things with them. The falling star beasts were the creatures that came down with the meteors. Monstrous entities, part stone and part beast, that descended from the sky inside the falling stars and emerged onto the surface of the lands between as threats to whatever was beneath them. The constant danger of meteors bringing such monsters to the lands between was a real and ongoing problem, and it was a problem that the gravity sorceries were uniquely suited to address, because gravity was the force that governed the falling. An alabaster lord with skin of stone, teaching gravity magic to the young Radahn, was teaching the discipline of the falling stars to the warrior who would one day stop the stars from falling. The lineage of the knowledge runs from the things that fell from the sky to the being who would hold the sky in place. The teacher came from the stars. The student would conquer them. Radahn did not know, studying gravity in Sellia for Leonard's sake, that the discipline he was learning would become the only thing capable of answering the threat the sky would one day pose. He was learning to keep a horse. He was, without knowing it, learning to save the world from what the sky kept dropping on it. The warrior, who was also a sorcerer. Radahn's mastery of gravity made him something that the lands between had not quite seen before, and the rarity of it is worth dwelling on. The traditions of the warrior and the sorcerer were, in the world of the Golden Order, distinct paths. The knights and the soldiers and the great champions of the battlefield were one kind of being. The scholars and the glintstone sorcerers of Raya Lucaria were another. They overlapped at the edges, in the battle mages and the spellblades who combined some sword work with some sorcery, but the great figures tended to be one thing or the other. The mightiest warriors were not the mightiest sorcerers, and the mightiest sorcerers did not lead armies into battle from the front. Radahn was both at the highest level. He was the strongest warrior among the demigods, feared above all others in martial terms, the general whose army could not be broken. And he was a master of a complete school of sorcery, the gravity discipline that he had learned in Sellia, powerful enough in that discipline to one day challenge the stars. He did not sacrifice the warrior to become the sorcerer or the sorcerer to become the warrior. He was the supreme expression of both, combined into a single being whose fighting style wove the sword and the gravity magic into one seamless thing. This combination is part of what made him so feared during the Shattering. An enemy facing Radahn faced a giant with enormous blades who could also reach across the battlefield with gravitational force, who could pull them into range and crush them with manipulated weight, who fought as both the strongest knight and a master sorcerer at once. There was no good way to fight such a being. Close the distance and face the blades of a giant. Keep the distance and face the gravity sorceries that closed the distance for him. The Red Lion General had no exploitable weakness in the structure of his capabilities, which is why it was said that the Redmanes, fighting under a general like that, knew no weakness either. The gravity magic learned for Leonard's sake was the thing that completed Radahn as a fighter. Without it, he would have been a giant with swords, formidable but answerable. With it, he became the thing that nothing in the lands between could defeat in open battle, the warrior whose only conqueror would be a disease delivered by a sister who knew she could not beat him any other way. The Gravity Crest. When Radahn had earned the moniker that would define him, he engraved the Gravity Crest upon his blades. The Starscourge title, the name that recorded his conquest of the stars, was marked into the weapons he carried, the twin greatswords that he wielded in battle. The crest of gravity, the symbol of the discipline he had mastered, became part of his martial identity, carved into the instruments of his war. The blades themselves were enormous, matched to his size, the weapons of a giant who fought as a giant fought. He wielded them with the gravitational magic woven into his combat, so that the swing of the blades and the pull of gravity worked together, the physical force of a demigod's strength amplified by the manipulation of weight and pull that the gravity sorceries allowed. There is something fitting about the gravity crest on the blades. Radahn's weapons carried the mark of the magic he had learned for Leonard's sake, the discipline that had begun as a way to keep a horse and had become the foundation of a warrior's legend. Every time he raised his blades, the crest of the gravity magic was there, the record of the gentle origin carried into the violence of the battlefield. The young general who had gone to Sellia to study, who had learned gravity from an alabaster lord with skin of stone, who had mastered the manipulation of weight so that his scrawny horse could carry him, had become the warrior whose blades bore the crest of the stars he would one day crush. The arc from the study in Sellia to the conquest of the heavens runs through Leonard, through the refusal to abandon something loved, through the gentle reason that grew into cosmic power. Radahn rode Leonard into the battles that built his legend. The scrawny horse carried the giant warrior, made possible by the gravity magic, across the fields where the Redmanes fought under the banner of the red-maned lion. The general and his beloved steed, the impossible pairing made workable by the power that would one day hold the stars, riding together through the years of Radahn's glory. The lore does not record what happened to Leonard. The horse appears in Radahn's story as the reason for the magic, and then recedes, present in the explanation of why Radahn learned what he learned, and absent from the accounts of what the learning produced in the end. Somewhere in the story of the Red Lion General is a scrawny horse that a giant loved enough to reshape his own relationship to gravity rather than leave behind. The conquest of the stars is the famous part. Leonard is the part that explains it. Sleep well. Tomorrow the stars begin to fall, and the magic learned for a horse meets the threat that will make Radahn the Starscourge. There came a time when the stars themselves were the enemy. This is the feat that gave Radahn his name and his place in the legend of the lands between. Not the battles against other demigods, not the army he led, not the territory he governed. The thing that the songs remembered, that the texts recorded, that the title Starscourge preserved, was that Radahn fought the stars and won. He challenged the swirling constellations, conquered them, and arrested their movement, freezing the heavens in place through the force of his gravitational will. Tonight we sit with the largest thing Radahn ever did, and with what it cost the cosmos to have a warrior strong enough to do it. The threat from above. The sky of the lands between was a danger. We touched on this in the matter of the Alabaster Lords and the Falling Star Beasts, but it deserves fuller attention now because the conquest of the stars was a response to a threat rather than an act of conquest for its own sake. Stars fell. The celestial bodies that moved through the sky of the lands between did not stay in the sky reliably. They came down as meteors, as falling stars, and when they came down, they brought catastrophe with them. The falling star beasts rode the meteors to the surface, monstrous entities of stone and malice that emerged from the impact sites to threaten whatever was near. The falling of a star was not a beautiful thing in the lands between. It was the arrival of a disaster. The region most exposed to this threat was Caelid, Radahn's own domain, and the town of Sellia in particular. where the study of gravity magic was bound up with the constant proximity to the falling stars. Sellia stood in a place where the sky's threat was a regular fact of life, where the meteors came down and the falling star beasts emerged, and the people who lived there had to contend with the danger from above as a permanent feature of their existence. Radahn, the demigod who governed Khalid, the warrior who had studied gravity in Sellia, was the being positioned to do something about this. He had the power, the specific magical discipline, and the personal connection to the threatened region. The stars were falling on his lands. He had spent his youth mastering the force that governed the falling. The convergence of the threat and the capability produced the feat. The Conquest. Radahn challenged the stars. The lore describes this with a directness that the scale of the act almost makes difficult to absorb. The sorceress Selene, explaining Radahn to the Tarnished, says that the massive warrior challenged the swirling constellations themselves, and that his victory over these celestial bodies was total enough to leave them frozen in the sky. He is the force that repulses the stars. If General Radahn were to die, the stars would resume their movement. The Starscourge heirloom preserves the feat in the register of the heroic. The mightiest hero of the demigods confronted the falling stars alone, and thus did he crush them, his conquest engraved upon the heirloom as the defining achievement of his legend. Alone, not with his army, not with the help of other demigods, not through any collective effort. The mightiest hero confronted the falling stars alone and crushed them. What this meant in practice was that Radahn used his gravitational magic at a scale that no other being could reach, applying the force he had mastered to the celestial bodies themselves. The stars moved through the sky according to the gravitational forces that governed them. Radahn, master of gravity, turned his mastery against those forces and arrested the movement of the stars, holding them in place against the natural motion that would have carried them through their cycles. He saved Sellia. During the Starscourge conflict, Radahn saved Sellia by conquering the stars and arresting their cycles. The town that had lived under the constant threat of the falling stars was protected by the general who froze the stars in place, who stopped the falling by stopping the movement, who used the gravity magic he had learned in that very town to defend it from the sky. The threat from above ceased. With the stars frozen, the meteors stopped falling. The falling star beasts stopped arriving. The catastrophe from the sky was held in suspension by the will of the warrior who had conquered the heavens. Khalid, in this period, was protected. The Red Lion General had answered the threat that the sky posed to his lands, and the answer was the most cosmic feat any demigod had accomplished. Delaying fate. But the conquest of the stars was not a simple victory, and the lore is careful to record the deeper consequence of what Radahn had done. The stars of the lands between were not merely celestial bodies. They were connected to fate, to destiny, to the cosmic forces that governed the unfolding of the world's future. The movement of the stars was the movement of fate itself, the turning of the cycles that carried the world from one age to the next. When Radahn arrested the movement of the stars, he did not only stop the meteors from falling, he delayed fate. He sealed the cycles. He held not just the physical stars, but the destinies that the stars carried, frozen in place along with the celestial bodies themselves. The lore preserves this in the description of what the Starscourge accomplished. The stop of the stars' movement by Radahn's conquest resulted in the suspension of the life cycle of the stars, the sealing of the fate that the stars carried. To stop the stars was to stop time, in a particular cosmic sense. To freeze the heavens was to freeze the future that the heavens governed. This is the consequence that would make Radahn's conquest into an obstacle, because one of the destinies that the stars carried, one of the fates that Radhan's conquest had sealed, was the destiny of his half-sister Ranni. Ranni's path to her particular future, the age of stars that she sought to bring about, required the movement of the stars. Her destiny was a destiny of the night sky, of the moon and the stars and the cosmic order that the Carian tradition looked toward, and the stars were frozen. Radahn, by conquering the heavens to save Sellia, had locked the sky in place, and the locked sky was the obstacle that stood between Ranni and the future she was working toward. This is one of the great structural ironies of the lore. Radahn and Ranni were half-siblings, both children of Renala, both carrying the Carian blood and its connection to the stars. And Radhan's conquest of the stars, his great heroic feat, the thing he did to save his lands from the threat above, became the thing that blocked his sister's destiny. For Ranni to achieve her age of stars, the stars had to move again. For the stars to move again, Radahn had to die, because he was the force that repulsed them, and only his death would release them back into their cycles. The Red Lion General had, without intending it, made himself the obstacle to his sister's fate. The conquest that defined his legend was the conquest that marked him for death in the schemes of those who needed the stars to move. Why he did it, the lore does not give a single, clearly stated reason for why Radahn conquered the stars, and this absence has produced interpretation among those who study the story. The clearest reason is the protection of Sellia and Caelid from the threat of the falling stars. This is the reason the lore states most plainly. Radahn saved Sellia by conquering the stars and arresting their cycles. The threat from above was real. The falling star beasts were a genuine danger, and Radhan's conquest of the stars ended the threat. A demigod protecting his lands from a cosmic danger is a sufficient explanation for the feat on its own. There is a deeper interpretation that some who study the lore have proposed, connected to the rivalry of destinies between Radahn and Ranni. The freezing of the stars hindered Ranni's path to godhood, and it is possible that Radhan's conquest was, in part, an act aimed at preventing the age of stars that Ranni sought. If the demigods were in competition during the Shattering, and if stopping a rival Empyrean from ascending to godhood would have been a priority, then freezing the stars that carried Ranni's destiny could have been a strategic act as much as a protective one. The lore does not confirm this. It states the protection of Sellia as the reason and leaves the deeper strategic interpretation as a possibility rather than a fact. What is certain is the consequence. Whatever Radhan's reasons, the result was that the stars were frozen, fate was delayed, and Ranni's destiny was blocked until the day Radahn would die and release the heavens. The gentlest reading connects back to Leonard and the kindness at the root of Radhan's power. Radahn was noble, admired, a protector of his people. The conquest of the stars in this reading was an act of protection. The same impulse that had made him learn gravity for his horse's sake now applied at cosmic scale to defend his lands from the sky. The warrior who would not abandon his scrawny horse would not abandon his people to the falling stars. He held the heavens in place to keep his land safe, and the cosmic consequences of that protection were not his intention, but the side effect of a protective act at a scale that only a demigod could perform. Whatever the reason, the feat stood. The stars were frozen. Radahn was the Starscourge, and in the sky above the lands between, the constellations hung motionless, held by the will of a single warrior, waiting for the day his grip would fail. The stars and the Carian sky. To understand the full weight of what Radahn did, it helps to understand what the stars meant to the tradition he came from. The Carians, the royal family of his mother, Rennala, were a people of the night sky. Their magic drew its power from the moon and the stars, rather than from the Erdtree's golden grace. Their queen was the queen of the full moon. Their greatest sorceries were sorceries of the moon, the dark moon and the full moon, and the celestial bodies that moved through the night. To be Carian was to look upward at the stars and see in them not a threat, but a source of power, a cosmic order that the Carian tradition revered and studied and drew upon. Radahn carried this blood. He was Rennala's son, with the Carian connection to the night sky in his lineage. And what he did to the stars was, from the Carian perspective, a kind of violence against the very thing his mother's people revered. He did not draw power from the stars in the Carian way. He conquered them, froze them, held them against their nature. The Carian relationship to the stars was one of reverence and study. Radahn's relationship to the stars was one of domination. This adds a layer to the conflict with Ranni, who was also Carian, also Rennala's child, also connected to the night sky by blood and tradition. Ranni's destiny, the Age of Stars, was a Carian destiny, a future built around the cosmic order that the Carian tradition revered. For Ranni to pursue the Carian relationship to the stars, Radahn's domination of the stars had to end. Two children of the Queen of the Full Moon, one revering the stars and one dominating them, their destinies set against each other by the very celestial bodies their shared tradition was built around. The frozen sky. There is something worth pausing on in the image of the frozen sky itself, because it is one of the most striking pieces of environmental storytelling in the lands between. When the Tarnished looks up at the night sky over Caelid, the stars are wrong. They hang motionless in formations that do not move, frozen in the configurations that Radahn's conquest locked them into. The sky over Caelid is a sky held in suspension, a visible monument to the feat that the region's protector had performed. Every night that the stars do not move is a night that proves Radahn still holds them, that his power still reaches up into the heavens and keeps the cosmos in place. This is the kind of detail that makes the lore of the lands between distinctive. The conquest of the stars is not just a story told in item descriptions. It is written across the sky, visible to anyone who looks up, a permanent feature of the world that the player can observe. The frozen stars are Radahn's signature on the cosmos, the proof of his power held up for all to see. And when Radahn dies, the sky changes. The stars resume their movement. The frozen configurations break apart and the celestial bodies return to their cycles, and a great star falls, the star that had been held back, crashing into Limgrave and opening the hole that leads down to Nokron, the eternal city. The death of Radahn is written across the sky, just as his conquest was, the resumption of the stars' movement marking the end of the force that had repulsed them. The sky that proved his power becomes the sky that proves his death. This connects Radahn's fate to the larger machinery of the world's destiny. His conquest froze fate. His death releases it. The falling of the held-back star into Limgrave, opening the path to Nokron, is the first step in the unfolding of the destiny that his conquest had blocked, the destiny that runs through Ranni and the Age of Stars, and the future that the frozen sky had been holding back. The cosmos waited, frozen, for the warrior's grip to fail. When it failed, the cosmos resumed, and the future began to move again. The title and the legend. Having conquered the stars, Radahn earned the name that would define him. Starscourge, the scourge of the stars, the being who had scourged the heavens, the warrior whose conquest of the constellations was so complete that his name recorded it permanently. He engraved the gravity crest upon his blades, as we have noted, marking the weapons with the symbol of the discipline that had let him perform the feat. The title and the crest together made Radahn's identity inseparable from the conquest of the stars. He was not just a general, not just a demigod, not just the strongest warrior of his kind. He was the Starscourge, the being who had done the impossible thing to the sky, and the name carried the weight of the feat wherever he went. The legend spread. The songs that the lands between sang about Radahn were songs about the conquest of the stars, about the mightiest hero who confronted the falling stars alone and crushed them. The feat became the defining fact of his reputation, the thing that everyone knew about the Red Lion General, the achievement that placed him above the other demigods in the popular understanding of their relative greatness. It was a true legend. Radahn had done what the songs said he did. The stars were frozen in the sky as the visible, permanent proof of the feat, hanging motionless above the lands between for anyone to see. The conquest was not a story that had grown in the telling. It was a fact, written across the sky, maintained by the continuing will of the warrior who had performed it, and it would hold until he could no longer hold it. The frozen stars were a function of Radahn's living power. He was the force that repulsed them. As long as he lived and retained his strength, the stars stayed frozen. The day his strength failed, whether through death or through the destruction of his mind, the stars would resume their movement, fate would resume its course, and the destiny that the conquest had blocked would be free to unfold. That day was coming. It would come through the one weapon that could defeat the undefeatable warrior. Not strength, which no one had enough of to overcome him, but rot, delivered by the sister, who had calculated that if she could not beat Radahn, she could at least poison him. Sleep well. Tomorrow we turn to the Redmanes, the army that loved their general, and the bonds of honor that would shape the terrible mercy of his end. A general is made by the soldiers who follow him, and Radahn's soldiers followed him with a devotion that the lore preserves in detail. The Redmanes, named for the red-maned lion raising a sword that they wore on their surcoats in the image of their general, were not a conscript army held together by fear and discipline. They were warriors who had chosen Radahn, who fought under his banner because of what he was, who carried his image into battle as a thing they were proud to bear. It was popularly said that the Redmanes knew no weakness. The phrase is worth holding on to because it captures both the martial reputation of the army and something about the bond between the soldiers and the general. An army knows no weakness when it is led by someone the soldiers believe in, when the general's strength becomes the army's confidence, when the bond between leader and led produces a force greater than the sum of the individual warriors. Tonight we sit with the Redmanes, with the figures who served Radahn most closely, and with the oath that would become the instrument of the most painful mercy in his story. Ogre, the first Redmane. The longest serving of the Redmane knights was Ogre. He had been with Radahn from the beginning, and his connection to the general ran deeper than the ordinary bond between a soldier and his commander. Ogre had studied the techniques of manipulating gravity alongside Radahn himself in Sellia, during the period when the young general was learning the discipline that would define him. This detail tells us something about how Radahn related to those closest to him. The gravity magic was the most personal thing Radahn possessed, the discipline he had learned for Leonard's sake, the power that would become the foundation of his legend, and he had not learned it alone. Olga had been there, studying the same techniques, mastering the same discipline, sharing in the most personal aspect of what Radahn was becoming. The longest-serving Redmane was not just a soldier who had served the longest. He was a companion from the period of the general's formation, someone who had been present for the learning that made Radahn who he was. Olga fought through the wars that built Radahn's legend, and through the Shattering that followed. At some point during the Shattering, he fell in battle, and he was rewarded with a burial in the war-dead catacombs. The honor of the burial reflected his standing. The longest-serving Redmane, the companion of the general's youth, lay to rest with the recognition that his service had earned. The lore preserves Olga as a presence in Radahn's story, a bell-bearing that the Tarnished can find, the spirit of a Redmane who had been with the general from the start. Freya, the gladiator. During his youth, Radahn witnessed the valor of a gladiator called Freya. She fought with a quality that caught the general's attention, a strength and a courage in the arena that marked her as the kind of warrior Radahn wanted in his ranks. He asked her to become a member of his knights, and she accepted. This is a small story, but it tells us about Radahn's eye for warriors and his way of building his army. He did not only inherit soldiers or conscript them. He recruited the ones whose valor he witnessed and admired, extending the invitation to join the Redmanes to those who had proven themselves in the kind of combat that revealed character. Freya had shown her worth as a gladiator, and Radahn, recognizing it, offered her a place among his most trusted warriors. She took it and became Redmane Freya, one of the distinguished knights whose armor bore the golden markings of her position in Radahn's ranks. Freya's loyalty to Radahn was real, and her story carries one of the threads that runs from Radahn's army into the events of the Land of Shadow. At the Battle of Aeonia, the battle against Malenia that would destroy Radahn, Freya was left for dead in the swamp, slowly succumbing to the scarlet rot that Malenia had unleashed. Her life was spared when Miquella's visage appeared before her and drew the poisonous rot from her wound. With that act, Freya became charmed by Miquella, following him into the realm of shadow, her loyalty transferring from the general she had served to the brother who had saved her. This transfer of loyalty is a detail worth marking, because it connects to the larger pattern of how Miquella drew Radahn's people to himself. Freya had been Radahn's. After Aeonia, after the rot, after Miquella's intervention, she was Miquella's. The charm that Miquella worked on those around him reached even into the ranks of Radahn's most loyal knights, taking a warrior who had served the Red Lion general and making her a follower of the brother who would one day claim Radahn's soul. Jeren, the restless tumbleweed. The most significant of the figures around Radahn was Castellan Jeren, and his story is the one that matters most for the end of Radahn's. Jeren was a nomadic warrior. The lore describes him with a particular and affectionate phrase, the restless tumbleweed of a man, someone whose nature was to wander, who did not settle, who moved through the world without the bonds that tie most people to places and institutions. He happened upon being a guest of the Carian royal family at Caria Manor during the period when Radahn resided there, and during his time with the Carians, he became acquainted with various members of the family, including Rani, Iji, and Radahn. The connection with the Carians gave Jeren obligations he had not previously carried. With Rani and Iji, he made a promise to slay a long-standing enemy of the Carian family, the graven witch Selen, who had committed atrocities against her fellow sorcerers. This promise would remain with Jeren across his entire arc, a thread of his story that the Tarnished can follow long after Radahn's death. But before he could fulfill it, Radahn recruited him, The general brought the nomadic warrior into his army as a guest commander during the Shattering, and for the first time, the restless tumbleweed of a man was bound by an oath. This is the transformation that Jeren's story turns on. The wanderer who did not settle, who moved without bonds, was bound at last by the oath he swore to Radahn. He became Castellan of Redmane Castle, the holder of the fortress, tied to a place and a person in a way that his nomadic nature had never permitted before. The oath that Jeren and Radahn swore was a mutual oath of honourable death. They swore to preserve each other's honour by giving the other a warrior's death, should it ever come to that. This is the kind of oath that warriors who respect each other swear, a promise that if the end comes, it will come honourably, in battle, in the manner befitting a great warrior, rather than through some lesser or shameful means. Two warriors who valued honour above almost everything swore to ensure that the other would not be denied the death a warrior deserved. Neither of them could have known how thoroughly this oath would be tested. The mutual oath of honourable death was sworn between two men at the height of their powers, when an honourable death in battle was the natural assumption about how a great warrior's life would end. What the oath would in the end require of Jeren was something far stranger and far more painful. The arrangement of his friend's death, not in the prime of his strength, but in the depths of a degradation so complete that death was the only mercy left. The friendship. The relationship between Radahn and Jeren was a friendship, and the lore is clear about this in a way that elevates the eventual tragedy. Jeren was Radahn's friend since his time in the Carian castle. They were not merely a general and a subordinate commander. They were friends, two warriors who had known each other since before the Shattering, whose bond had grown across the years of shared service into something that the mutual oath of honourable death formalised. The flamberge that Jeren wielded, a great sword with a flame-like undulation in the blade, became one of the symbols of Redmane Castle itself. The detail about the flame is not incidental. Scarlet rot is kept at bay with flame at Redmane Castle, and Jeren's beloved sword, with its flame-like blade, became the symbol of the castle that held the rot at bay. After Radahn was afflicted with the scarlet rot, the castle that Jeren held became a place defined by the effort to keep the rot back, and the flame-bladed sword of the castle's keeper was the emblem of that effort. The friendship between Radahn and Jeren is the human centre of the tragedy that the later parts of this story will tell. When Radahn was reduced by the scarlet rot to a mindless husk, a crazed animal wandering the battlefield and devouring the corpses of friend and foe alike, it was Jeren who carried the burden of what to do about it. The friend who had sworn the oath of honourable death was the one bound to fulfil it, the one who had to find a way to give his degraded friend the warrior's death that the rot had denied him. Jeren's solution would be the Festival of War, the event that he hosted at Redmane Castle to draw champions who might give Radahn the honourable death in combat that the oath required. But the festival is a later part. For now, in the period before the Shattering's catastrophe, Radahn and Jeren were friends and fellow warriors, bound by an oath that they assumed would be fulfilled in the ordinary way of great warriors, with neither of them imagining the form the fulfillment would take. Red Bear and the warriors who were lost. Not every Redmane story ended in honour or loyalty. The army that knew no weakness was made of individuals, and individuals could be lost in ways that the lore preserves as cautionary fragments of the larger picture. There was a warrior known only as Red Bear, his true identity lost to madness. He had been a Redmane, one of the soldiers who fought under the red-maned lion banner. Then he became fascinated by the strength of a great red bear he had bested in combat, and the fascination consumed him. He abandoned his former allegiance, his identity dissolving into the obsession, until all that remained was the name Red Bear and the madness that had taken the warrior who once bore a true name. The detail is small, but it sits in the lore as a reminder that the Redmanes were not a uniform mass of loyal soldiers. They were warriors, with the particular vulnerabilities that warriors have: the fascination with strength, the obsession with combat, the risk of losing oneself in the pursuit of martial excellence. Red Bear is the example of a Redmane who lost himself not to the scarlet rot that took his general, but to the simpler madness of an obsession with a worthy foe. It is a quiet foreshadowing of what would happen to Radahn himself. The general, too, would lose his identity, would become a creature defined by combat alone, would be reduced to something that wandered and fought without the mind that had made him who he was. Red Bear lost himself to fascination with a bear's strength. Radahn would lose himself to the rot. Both ended as warriors without the selves they had been, fighting on past the point where the fighting meant anything the original person would have recognized. Redmane Castle itself was a place defined by the holding of the line. After the Scarlet Rot came to Caelid, the castle became one of the few places where the rot was kept at bay, held back by flame. The Redmanes who remained there after the catastrophe were warriors maintaining a position against an encroaching disease, keeping the flames burning that kept the rot back, holding the fortress of a general who could no longer hold himself. The culture of the Redmanes, the loyalty and the strength and the refusal to yield, persisted in the castle even after the general it had been built around was gone in everything but body. The general his soldiers knew. It is worth gathering, before we turn to the Shattering and its catastrophe, the picture of Radahn that the Redmanes knew. He was the strongest, the general feared as the mightiest of the demigods, the warrior who had conquered the stars, the commander whose army knew no weakness. The Redmanes served the strongest warrior in the lands between, and the knowledge of his strength was part of what made them what they were. He was also kind. The lore returns to this again and again, and the soldiers who served Radahn most closely knew it best. He was a caring leader to his personal army, admired by many for his noble qualities. The recruitment of Freya, the lifelong companionship with Ogre, the friendship with Jeren. These are the marks of a general who related to his soldiers as people he valued, rather than as instruments he used. The Redmanes knew no weakness in part because they served someone worth being strong for, and he was honourable. The mutual oath of honourable death that he swore with Jeren reflects a being for whom honour was a central value, who cared about the manner of a warrior's death, who wanted for himself and for his friend the kind of end that honoured what they had been. This commitment to honour would become, in the cruelty of what the Shattering did to him, the thing that made his fate so painful. A being who valued an honourable death above almost everything was denied it, reduced to a mindless husk, kept alive in a state that was the opposite of everything he had valued, his honour the cruelest casualty of his fate. The Redmanes knew a general who was strong, kind, and honourable. The story of what happened to him is the story of how each of those qualities was turned against him by the catastrophe of the Shattering and the schemes of those who would use him. His strength made him a target, because the strongest demigod was the one the others most needed to bring down. His kindness made his degradation pitiable, because the more beloved and noble he had been, the more terrible it was to see him reduced to a mindless husk. His honor made the denial of an honourable death the cruelest possible fate, because a being who valued an honourable death above almost everything was kept alive in dishonour, denied the warrior's end he had sworn to give and receive. The three qualities that made Radahn admirable became, through the machinery of his fate, the three axes of his tragedy. This is the structure that the remaining parts of his story will trace. Not the fall of a villain, but the degradation of a hero, each of his virtues converted by circumstance into a source of his suffering. The Redmanes who loved him would watch it happen, and one of them, bound by an oath, would have to find a way to end it. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Shattering comes. The last two of Marika's offspring face each other, and the strongest demigod meets the one weapon that could bring him down. The Shattering began with a death and a queen's despair. At some point following the Night of the Black Knives, the night that Godwyn the Golden was killed in the assassination that broke the rules of how demigods could die, Queen Marika shattered the Elden Ring. The great rune that organized the reality of the lands between, the structure that held the Golden Order together, was broken by the hand of the god who had ruled through it, and her offspring acquired the great runes, the shards of the shattered ring, each demigod taking a portion of the broken whole. What followed was war. The demigods, each holding a shard of the Elden Ring, made war on each other for the shards they did not hold. The Shattering War was the conflict that broke the lands between, the war among Marika's children that reduced the Golden Realm to the ruin that the Tarnished would one day walk through. Each demigod fought for the pieces the others held, and the war ground on across the territories of the lands between, demigod against demigod, army against army. Tonight we follow Radahn into that war, and to the battle that would define and destroy him. The strongest in the war. When the Shattering War commenced, Radahn was the demigod the others feared most. He was the strongest. This had been true before the Shattering, and it remained true during it. General Radahn was feared as the strongest demigod during the Shattering, the warrior whose army could not be broken, and whose personal power could not be matched in open battle. The Redmanes supported their general's claim to the shards, and the army that knew no weakness carried Radahn's war across the lands between. No demigod could defeat Radahn in the kind of battle that demigods fought. His strength of arms, his gravity magic, his army, his personal nature as the mightiest hero of the demigods. All of it made him the apex of the martial hierarchy. The other demigods had their own powers and their own armies and their own claims to the shards, but none of them could meet Radahn in open battle and win. To fight Radahn head-on was to lose. This is the situation that produced the Battle of Aeonia. By the final phase of the Shardbearers' War, the field of demigods had narrowed. Of Marika's offspring who remained standing as contenders in the war, two were left to face each other, Radahn and Malenia. The strongest demigod, the Red Lion General who had conquered the stars, against Malenia, Blade of Miquella, the demigod whose own nature carried a curse that would make her the one weapon capable of bringing Radahn down. Malenia, Blade of Miquella. Malenia was Miquella's twin, one of the two Empyrean children whose shared curse defined them. Where Miquella was cursed to remain eternally a child, never growing into the power his nature promised, Malenia was cursed with the scarlet rot, born with the rot inside her, carrying within her body a disease that would define her and consume her in the end. She was a warrior of extraordinary capability, Blade of Miquella, the title that marked her as her brother's protector and champion, the sword that defended the gentle Empyrean who could not defend himself. She had trained and fought and become one of the greatest warriors in the lands between, undefeated in the duels and battles that had built her own legend. She had never known defeat. The lore preserves this as a fact about Malenia, that the Battle of Aeonia would complicate. She was undefeated, and she would remain undefeated in a technical sense even after Aeonia, because what happened at Aeonia was not a defeat in the ordinary sense. The meeting of Radahn and Malenia at Aeonia was the meeting of the two strongest remaining demigods, each undefeated, each at the height of their power. Radahn the strongest, the conqueror of stars, the general whose army knew no weakness. Malenia the undefeated, blade of Miquella, the warrior who had never lost. The battle between them would be one of the defining events of the Shattering, the clash that would determine which of the last two contenders would prevail, and it would be decided not by skill or strength in the end, but by the curse that Malenia carried. The Battle of Aeonia. The battle was fought in Caelid, in Radahn's own domain, on the lands that the Red Lion General governed and protected. This is part of the tragedy of what happened. The battle that would destroy Radahn was fought on his own territory, and the destruction it brought would fall not only on Radahn, but on Caelid itself, the verdant land that would be transformed by the battle into the rotting wasteland the Tarnished walks through. The two demigods fought. The lore does not give a detailed blow-by-blow of the combat, but it establishes the essential shape. The battle was fierce. The two strongest demigods matched against each other, neither able to overcome the other through the ordinary means of combat. Radahn's strength against Malenia's skill, the conqueror of stars against the blade of Miquella, the battle grinding on without a decisive resolution through conventional warfare. Malenia could not defeat Radahn through skill alone. This is the crucial fact. Even Malenia, the undefeated, the blade of Miquella, could not overcome the strongest demigod through the combat at which she excelled. Radahn was too strong. The general, who could not be beaten in open battle, could not be beaten by Malenia either. Not through the sword work and the martial skill that had made her undefeated. So she used the rot. To match Radahn's measure, Malenia bloomed into the scarlet rot. She snapped Miquella's needle, the instrument that had been keeping her own rot in check, and unleashed her first ever scarlet Aeonia bloom. The rot that she carried within her, the curse of her birth, was released in a great bloom of scarlet rot that spread across the battlefield and into Radahn and into Caelid itself. The flower of rot bloomed at Aeonia, giving the battle and the region its name, and the rot spread out from the bloom to poison everything it touched. What the rot did. Radahn survived the encounter. This is important. Malenia did not kill Radahn at Aeonia. The bloom of scarlet rot did not end his life. In the technical accounting of the battle, neither demigod killed the other, and Malenia's record as undefeated remained intact only in the narrow sense that she was not defeated, while her use of the rot meant she had not won either. But Radahn was afflicted with the incurable scarlet rot, the disease that Malenia carried, that she had unleashed in the Aeonia bloom, entered Radahn and took root in him, and it was incurable. The strongest demigod, the conqueror of stars, the general whose army knew no weakness, was infected with a disease that nothing could cure, that would do to him slowly what no warrior could do quickly. Over time, the rot ate away at him. This is the horror at the center of Radahn's story. He was not killed in battle, given the honourable death that a warrior of his stature deserved, and that his oath with Jeren anticipated. He was poisoned with an incurable disease that degraded him slowly, eating away at his body and, worse, at his mind. the rot consumed his wits, degenerating the mightiest hero of the demigods into a feral beast, a husk of his former glory, little more than a crazed animal. The being that remained after the rot had done its work was not Radahn in any meaningful sense. He still had his body, his strength, his gravity magic, even his horse. But the mind was gone. The noble general, the kind leader, the honourable warrior who had sworn the oath of honourable death, was reduced to a crazed animal wandering the battlefield, devouring the corpses of Cleanrot and Redmane alike. He ate the dead. The general who had been beloved by his soldiers, who had recruited Freya and studied gravity with Ogre and sworn brotherhood with Jeren, was reduced to a mindless thing that consumed the corpses of his own knights alongside the corpses of his enemies. This is the pitiful existence that Malenia inflicted upon him. Not death, something worse than death for a being who valued honour. The loss of the self, the degradation into a mindless beast, the continuation of mere existence after everything that made the existence meaningful had been eaten away by the rot. The nature of the rot. To understand what was done to Radahn, it helps to understand what the Scarlet Rot was, because it was not an ordinary disease. The Scarlet Rot was an outer god's power, the influence of the god of rot, one of the outer gods whose forces pressed upon the lands between from beyond. It was not merely an illness in the sense of a sickness that a body catches and fights. It was a cosmic force of decay and corruption, a power that consumed and rotted and transformed whatever it touched, tied to one of the great external powers that contended for influence over the lands between. Malenia had been born with this rot inside her. The curse of her birth was that she carried the god of rot's power within her body, a goddess of rot in potential, the rot blooming through her across her life and held in check only by the efforts of her brother Miquella and the needle that kept it at bay. When she snapped the needle at Aeonia and unleashed the scarlet Aeonia bloom, she released the outer god's power that she carried, and what she released was not a quantity of poison, but a bloom of cosmic decay. This is why the rot that afflicted Radahn was incurable. It was not a disease that medicine could address. It was the power of an outer god, taking root in the strongest demigod, consuming him from within with a force that came from beyond the lands between, and that nothing in the lands between could counter. The flame at Redmane Castle could keep the rot at bay, holding it back from spreading, but it couldn't cure what had taken root in Radahn. The rot was in him, and it was the power of a god, and it ate him alive across the years that followed Aeonia. The horror of it is compounded by what it did to the mind. A physical disease might have killed Radahn cleanly, given him the death that a warrior could accept. The Scarlet Rot did something worse. It ate his wits, consuming the mind before the body, reducing the noble general to a mindless beast, while leaving him alive and strong enough to keep fighting and eating and existing in his degraded state. The outer god's power did not merely kill. It degraded, it consumed the self, it left a husk that wandered and devoured among the ruins of its own domain. The last two of Marika's offspring. There is a weight to the fact that it came down to Radahn and Malenia. Of all the children of Marika, all the demigods who had taken up shards of the Elden Ring and made war on each other across the Shattering, the last two standing as contenders were these two, the strongest and the undefeated. They were siblings in the broad sense that all of Marika's offspring were siblings, members of the same vast and broken family. The war that had set them against each other was a war among kin, demigod against demigod, the children of a god tearing apart the realm their mother had ruled. And the final phase of that war was the meeting of the two who had risen above the rest, Radahn, who could not be beaten in open battle, and Malenia, who had never been beaten at all. That their meeting ended in mutual ruin rather than a clean victory says something about the nature of the Shattering itself. The war among Marika's children did not produce a winner who would reunite the Elden Ring and restore the Golden Order. It produced exhaustion, stalemate, and ruin. The two strongest contenders met and destroyed each other, one reduced to a beast and one withdrawn to nurse her curse, and neither claimed the victory that the war had been fought for. The Shattering ground toward its end not with a triumph, but with the mutual destruction of its greatest figures. This is the state of the lands between when the Tarnished arrives. The Shattering is long over, in the sense that the active war has ground to a halt, but nothing has been resolved. The demigods hold their shards in their ruined domains. Radahn wanders the wailing dunes as a mindless husk. Malenia sleeps in the Erdtree, rotted and damaged. The Elden Ring remains shattered, the Golden Order remains broken, and the realm waits for someone from outside the exhausted contest of the demigods to come and finish what they could not. Radahn's place in this frozen aftermath is the most pitiable of all the demigods. The others, however ruined, retain themselves. Morgott guarded the capital with his mind intact. Rykard pursued his dark path knowingly. Rani schemed with full possession of her cunning. Radahn alone was reduced to a thing without a self, a beast that did not know what it was, kept alive by the rot in a state that the general he had been would have found more horrifying than any death. The strongest of them ended as the least, his mind eaten away, his honor stripped, his domain rotted, waiting in the dunes for someone to give him the end his oath had promised. What Aeonia cost? The Battle of Aeonia did not have a winner. This is one of its defining features and one of the saddest. Two of the greatest warriors the lands between had ever produced met in battle, and the result was not the triumph of one over the other, but the ruin of both. Radahn was reduced to a mindless husk, kept alive by the rot in a state that was the opposite of everything he had been. Malenia, having unleashed the rot, was herself consumed by the bloom she had created. She retreated to the Erdtree in a state of profound damage, the scarlet Aeonia having taken its toll on her as well as on Radahn. The two demigods who met at Aeonia both ended the battle destroyed, one reduced to a beast and the other withdrawn to nurse the catastrophe of her own curse. Caelid was destroyed. The verdant land that had been Radahn's domain, the seat of his power, the home of the Redmanes, was transformed by the scarlet Aeonia bloom into the rotting red wasteland that the Tarnished encounters. The rot spread across the region, poisoning the ground and twisting the creatures and staining the very sky with the sickly red of the disease. The land that Radahn had protected, that he had conquered the stars to defend from the threat above, was ruined by the battle fought upon it. The general who had saved Caelid from the falling stars could not save it from the rot, because the rot was inside him, and the land rotted with its lord. The dishonor of it is something the law marks explicitly. Although she failed in killing Radahn, Malenia dishonored him when she resorted to using the scarlet rot. The use of the rot was not an honourable defeat. It was a poisoning, a resort to a weapon that denied Radahn the warrior's death. He would have accepted and inflicted instead a slow degradation that stripped him of his honour along with his mind. Malenia, herself a warrior, dishonoured the warrior she could not beat, and the dishonour is part of what Jeren would later seek to remedy through the Festival of War. the strongest demigod was brought down, not by a stronger demigod, because there was none, not in honourable battle, because no one could give him that, by a disease delivered by the one being whose curse made her capable of it, on the lands he had sworn to protect, reducing him to a beast that ate the dead among the ruins of his own domain. Sleep well. Tomorrow Jeren hosts the festival that will give his friend the death the rot denied him, and the stars wait to move again. Starscourge Radahn, the Red Lion General, wanted nothing more than an honourable death. This is the line that the law offers as the centre of the festival's meaning, and it carries the whole weight of what Radahn had become. The strongest demigod, the conqueror of stars, reduced by the scarlet rot to a mindless beast wandering the wailing dunes, still alive, still devouring the dead, still holding the stars frozen in the sky through the last reflex of a power that had outlived the mind that wielded it. He could not die on his own. The rot had taken his wits, but not his life, and the husk that remained would wander the dunes forever, unless something ended it. Jeren decided to end it. Tonight we sit with the festival, the friend who hosted it, and the strange mercy of killing someone you love to free them from what they have become. The burden of the oath. Jeren and Radahn had sworn a mutual oath of honourable death. Each had promised to preserve the other's honour by giving him a warrior's death, should it come to that. When they swore it, at the height of their powers, the oath was an abstraction, the kind of promise that warriors make about a distant hypothetical. Neither imagined the form it would take. The form it took was this. Radahn was a mindless husk, incapable of dying on his own, wandering the dunes as a crazed animal. The honourable death that the oath promised could not be delivered by Jeren alone, because Radahn, even reduced as he was, even mindless, was still the strongest demigod, still possessed of the body and the strength and the gravity magic that had made him unbeatable. Jeren could not kill Radahn. No single warrior could. The husk retained the martial power of the general even after losing the mind. So Jeren devised the festival of war. If no single warrior could give Radahn the honourable death the oath required, perhaps many warriors could. The festival would gather champions from across the lands between, summon them to Redmane Castle, and send them against Radahn in the Wailing Dunes, a great battle of many champions against the one mindless demigod, in the hope that the combined assault would accomplish what no individual could, the death of the strongest demigod, delivered in battle, the honourable warrior's end that the rot had denied him. This is the meaning of the festival of war. It is not a celebration in any ordinary sense, though Jeren announces it with the language of celebration, calling champions to prepare for battle and claim glory and grab the great rune. Beneath the festive language is an act of love and grief, a friend arranging the death of the friend he had sworn to honour, gathering the champions who might at last free Radahn from the pitiful existence that Malenia's rot had inflicted upon him. Jeren began to host the festival when the stars aligned. He had been hosting it, the lore suggests, across the long aftermath of Aeonia, gathering champions and sending them against Radahn, hoping each time that this would be the festival that ended his friend's degradation. The festivals had not succeeded. Radahn still wandered the dunes when the Tarnished arrived, but Jeren kept hosting them, kept gathering champions, kept trying to fulfill the oath, because the alternative was to leave his friend in the mindless state forever. What Jeren knew. Jeren understood more than the festival's surface suggested. He knew that Radahn keeps Ranni's fate in stasis. The witch hunter, the guest of the Carian royals, who had known Ranni and Iji before he became Radhan's commander, understood the cosmic situation. The stars that Radahn had frozen carried Ranni's fate, and as long as Radahn lived and held the stars, Ranni's destiny was sealed. This gives the festival a second layer of meaning beyond the personal. Jeren hosted it to free his friend from degradation, yes, but he also knew that freeing Radahn would release the stars, and releasing the stars would free Ranni's fate. The festival served both the personal oath and the cosmic destiny. The death of Radahn would end his friend's suffering and unseal the future that the frozen stars had been holding back. Jeren's dialogue to the Tarnished, when he speaks of the matter, carries this knowledge. The stars alter the fate of the Carian royal family and the fate of Ranni. Long ago, General Radahn challenged the swirling constellations and in a crushing victory arrested their cycles. Jeren knows what Radhan's conquest did to the stars and to Ranni's fate. He knows that ending Radahn will release them. The festival is the instrument of both the personal mercy and the cosmic unsealing. There is something fitting in Jeren being the one who carries this knowledge and hosts this festival. He had known Ranni at the Carian court. He had sworn the oath to Radahn. He stood at the intersection of the personal and the cosmic, the friend who could free Radahn, and the Carian associate who knew what freeing Radahn would mean for Ranni's fate. The restless tumbleweed of a man bound at last by an oath found himself bound to an act that would serve both his friend and the destiny of the family that had first given him a place. The battle. The Tarnished can participate in the final festival of war. It triggers when the player sufficiently progresses Ranni the Witch's questline or reaches the Altar's Plateau for the first time. Numerous champions gather in Redmane Castle Plaza to challenge the mighty demigod who roams the Wailing Dunes. The champions who gather for the festival are a roll of notable figures from across the lands between, summoned to the battle against Radahn. The Tarnished can call upon them during the fight. Blade the Half-Wolf, Ranni's loyal shadow, Iron Fist Alexander, the great living jar warrior seeking the most glorious battles, Patches, the perennial coward and trickster, present even here, Okina, Great Horn Tragoth, and others, the champions who answer Jeren's call and lend their summon signs to the Tarnished facing Radahn in the dunes. The battle itself is one of the most distinctive in Elden Ring. Radahn fights as the mindless husk he has become, but the husk retains everything that made the general formidable. He rides his horse, the small mount that the gravity magic still allows him to ride, carrying the giant across the dunes. He wields his enormous blades. He uses the gravity magic, pulling and crushing, and in the battle's second phase, he launches himself into the sky and crashes down as a falling star, the conqueror of stars, become a meteor himself in the final expression of the gravity power. He fights without mind. There is no dialogue, no cinematic introduction, no spoken word from Radahn during the battle, because there is no Radahn left to speak. The husk fights on reflex and instinct, and the retained martial power of the general, a mindless beast that happens to be the strongest demigod, defending itself against the champions who have come to give it the death it cannot achieve on its own. The Tarnished, with the summoned champions, brings Radahn down. The strongest demigod, the conqueror of stars, falls at last in the Wailing Dunes, given the death in battle that the oath required and the rot had denied. It is not a clean triumph. It is the killing of a mindless husk, the ending of a beast that had once been a noble general, the fulfillment of a friend's terrible promise. But it is, in the logic of the oath and the festival, a mercy. Radahn wanted nothing more than an honourable death, The festival gave it to him. The champions who came. The role of champions who gather for the festival of war deserves a moment, because the people who answer Gerrin's call tell us something about the standing Radahn held even in his degraded state. These were not minor warriors. They were figures of note from across the lands between, drawn to the festival by the prospect of battling the strongest demigod and claiming his great rune. Iron Fist Alexander, the warrior jar, who sought out the most glorious battles in his quest to become a great warrior, came to the festival because a battle against Radahn was the kind of glorious contest his nature craved. Bled, Ranni's loyal half-wolf shadow, came because Ranni's fate was bound up with Radahn's death, and because Bled served Ranni's interests with total devotion. Patches, the eternal coward and opportunist, came as Patches always comes, looking for whatever advantage the chaos might offer. Okina, Great Horn Tragoth, and others added their summon signs to the gathering. That such champions came to fight a mindless husk says something about what Radahn remained even after the rot had taken his mind. He was still the strongest demigod. His body, his strength, his gravity magic, his great rune, all of it remained, and the prospect of battling and defeating the strongest demigod drew champions who sought glory or who served interests that required Radahn's death. The festival was a gathering of the lands, Between's notable warriors around the body of a general who could no longer think, each of them there for their own reasons, all of them serving Gerrin's purpose of giving Radahn the death the oath required. There is a poignancy in the champions celebrating the chance to fight Radahn. To them, he was a glorious foe, the strongest demigod, the conqueror of stars, the battle of a lifetime. To Gerrin, he was a friend being freed from degradation. The festival held both meanings at once, a celebration of glorious war for the champions who came, and a funeral mercy for the friend who hosted it. The same battle was a triumph and a grief depending on who was looking at it. The Wailing Dunes. The battlefield where Radahn wandered and where the festival's battle was fought has a name that carries its own weight, the Wailing Dunes. The eastern shore of Caelid, a stretch of sand and ruin where the mindless general roamed, where the corpses of previous champions and previous festivals lay scattered, where the rot-touched land gave way to the dunes along the sea. The dunes were a graveyard before the Tarnished arrived. The previous festivals had sent champions against Radahn, and the champions had fallen, and their bodies remained in the dunes as evidence of how many had tried and failed to give Radahn the death the oath required. The husk had been too strong for the festivals that came before. The dunes held the dead of those attempts, the warriors who had answered Gerrin's call across the long aftermath of Aeonia, and had not been enough to bring the strongest demigod down. This is the setting of Radahn's end. Not a glorious battlefield, not the field of one of his great victories, but a stretch of rotted dunes, where a mindless husk wandered among the corpses of the champions who had tried to free it. The conqueror of stars reduced to this, a beast in the dunes, surrounded by the dead of the festivals, waiting for the assault that would at last be enough. The grandeur of his legend and the squalor of his end stand in the sharpest possible contrast in the Wailing Dunes, the place where the strongest demigod met the mercy of his friend's terrible festival. The stars move again. When Radahn falls, the sky changes. He releases his gravitational hold on the stars, the force that repulsed them, that had held them frozen since the Conquest, ends with the death of the warrior who had maintained it. The stars resume their movement. The cosmos, frozen since Radahn's victory over the constellations, begins to turn again, and the fate that the frozen stars had sealed begins to move toward its unfolding. A shooting star crashes into Limgrave. The held-back star, released by Radahn's death, falls to the earth, its starfall crater revealing the hidden path to Nokron, the Eternal City. The death of Radahn opens the way to Nokron, the buried city that holds the secrets Ranni needs for her path, the next step in the destiny that the frozen stars had been holding back. This is the cosmic consequence of the festival. Jeren's personal mercy, the freeing of his friend from degradation, is also the unsealing of the fate that Radahn's conquest had locked. The death that ended Radahn's suffering also ended the stasis of the stars, releasing Ranni's fate, opening Nokron, setting in motion the chain of events that leads toward the Age of Stars. The personal and the cosmic resolve in the same moment. The friend is freed, and the future is freed with him. Ranni's path opens, with Radahn dead and the stars moving and Nokron accessible. The Tarnished, who follows Ranni's questline, can proceed toward the Age of Stars ending, the future that Ranni sought, the destiny that required the death of the brother who had frozen the sky. Radahn's death is the price of Ranni's fate, and the festival is the mechanism by which the price is paid. Jeren freed. After Radahn falls, Jeren is freed from his oath. The Castellan, who had been bound to Redmane Castle until Radahn met an honourable death, the restless tumbleweed bound at last by the oath he swore, is released by the fulfilment of the oath. He had given his friend the warrior's death the oath required. The festival had succeeded. The burden he had carried across the long aftermath of Aeonia, the obligation to free his friend from the pitiful existence the rot had inflicted, was discharged. The Tarnished can speak with Jeren in the chapel at Redmane Castle after the battle, and learn that he is freed from service. The bond is fulfilled. The friend is at rest. Jeren can return to the nomadic existence that the oath had interrupted, or pursue the other promise he had made, the promise to Ranni and Iji to slay the graven witch Sellen. The discharge of the oath to Radahn frees Jeren to become the witch hunter, to take up the other obligation that his time at the Carrion Court had given him. There is grief in Jeren's freedom. He had not wanted to kill his friend in the sense that anyone wants such a thing. He had wanted to honor him, to free him, to give him the death that befitted what he had been rather than leaving him in the degradation that the rot had made of him. The festival was an act of love expressed through the only means available, the gathering of champions to accomplish the mercy that the oath required. When Jeren speaks after the battle, the weight of what he has done is present beneath the discharge of the obligation. He has freed his friend. He has also killed him. Both things are true, and the oath made them the same act. This is the end of Radahn's story as the base game tells it. The strongest demigod, the conqueror of stars, the kind general beloved by his soldiers, brought down by rot to a mindless husk and freed at last by the festival of his grieving friend. The stars move again. Nokron opens. Ranni's path proceeds. Radahn's soul, in the lore of a world from which Marika removed the rune of death, does not pass into oblivion, but travels onward, to a place and a purpose that the base game does not reveal. The general was meant to rest. His soul went somewhere else instead, into the hand of a brother whose old vow had been waiting all along. Sleep well. Tomorrow the story takes its strangest turn, as a brother's old vow reaches into the land of shadow to call Radahn back from the death that freed him at last. Radahn had been freed. The festival had given him the honourable death his oath required. The stars had moved again. His soul had passed from the rotted husk in the wailing dunes. By the logic of the base game, his story was over. A tragedy resolved, A suffering ended, a friend's terrible mercy fulfilled. It was not over. In the law of a world from which the rune of death had been removed, where nobody stays dead in the way that death is supposed to mean, Radahn's soul did not pass into oblivion. It went into the hand of his half-brother Miquella, who had been planning, for longer than anyone knew, to bring Radahn back. The shadow of the Erdtree is the story of that plan, and it reveals that the most beloved general in the lands between had been, from his childhood, promised to a destiny he may never have chosen of his own free will. Tonight we follow the vow into the land of shadow. The vow of childhood. In their youth, Miquella and Radahn made a promise to each other. The remembrance of a god and a lord, obtained after the final battle of the DLC, preserves the nature of it. Miquella, even as a child, envisioned Radahn as a lord. The Starscourge's strength and kindness stood out to him among all the lords he might have chosen. The two qualities that Radahn embodied, and that Miquella, cursed to remain forever a child and afflicted by his own nature, did not possess in himself. Miquella looked at his brother and saw the lord he wanted, strong, kind, the qualities that would anchor the gentler world Miquella dreamed of building. The promise that the endgame flashback reveals is preserved in Miquella's own words. Lord brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place. Sit with this. Miquella, the child who would be a god, asking his strong and kind brother to be his consort when he ascended, promising in exchange to make the world gentler. The vow was a contract between two demigods. Radahn would serve as Miquella's consort and lord when Miquella became a god, and Miquella would use his godhood to build the age of compassion, the gentler world that his nature dreamed of. The strength of Radahn joined to the divinity of Miquella, the two together ruling a kinder order than the one Marika had built. There is a complication that the lore hints at. Miquella mentions a vow that seems independent of this promise, suggesting that the two brothers may have entered some mutual contract before the promise of consortship was made, something Radahn was expected to uphold. The exact nature of the original vow is not made clear. What is clear is that Radahn was bound to Miquella by a promise from their youth, a promise that would reach forward across the entire catastrophe of the Shattering and the Rot and the Festival to pull Radahn back from death into Miquella's service. Malenia's whisper. The vow casts a new light backward over the battle of Aeonia. When Malenia delivered what she intended as the final blow to Radahn at Aeonia, she whispered to him, "Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort." The line had been there in the base game, a cryptic fragment whose full meaning was not clear until the DLC revealed the vow. Malenia, blade of Miquella, fighting Radahn on her brother's behalf, named Radahn as the promised consort in the moment she tried to kill him. This recontextualizes the battle. Malenia did not fight Radahn only as a contender in the Shattering War. She fought him as Miquella's blade, and her words suggest that the battle was connected to Miquella's plan from the start. The interpretation that the lore community has drawn, and that the DLC supports, is that Radahn and Mog both needed to die for Miquella's plan to proceed, and that Malenia, the undefeated blade who had never known defeat, was the instrument chosen to kill Radahn, so that he could later be brought back in the form Miquella's plan required. If this reading is correct, then the tragedy of Radahn deepens further. The rot that destroyed his mind, the degradation in the Wailing Dunes, the festival, and the terrible mercy of Geren's oath. All of it may have been steps in Miquella's plan to bring Radahn back as his consort, Radahn was not only the victim of Malenia's curse and the Shattering's cruelty, he was, in this reading, a piece in his brother's long scheme, killed so that he could be resurrected in the body and the role that Miquella had chosen for him from childhood. Whether Radahn understood or consented to any of this is one of the questions the lore leaves open and painful. The vow was made in their youth. What Radahn agreed to, what he understood the vow to mean, whether the child who promised to be his brother's consort would have chosen the path that led through rot and degradation and resurrection in a stolen body. None of this is answered. The vow bound him. The plan used him. What he wanted is not recorded. Mog, the vessel. Miquella's plan required a body, and the body it required belonged to another of his brothers. Mog, Lord of Blood, was one of the Omen twins, born alongside Morgoth, with the horns and the cursed flesh that the Golden Order despised. He had been discarded by his parents for being an omen, cast into the sewers beneath the capital, and had risen from that rejection to build his own dynasty and his own power, the Lord of Blood, who sought to raise a new dynasty with his beloved Miquella as its god. Mog had abducted Miquella, taken the cocooned Empyrean to his dynasty's seat, and worked his bloody rituals to try to raise Miquella as the god of a new order with Mog at his side. What Mog did not understand was that he was being used. Mog was under Miquella's charm the entire time. The abduction that Mog believed was his own act, the rituals he performed to raise Miquella, the dynasty he dreamed of building. All of it served Miquella's purpose rather than Mog's. Miquella had charmed Mog, made him believe that Miquella was the way for Mog to channel the formless mother and build his dynasty, and used Mog's devotion to accomplish two things Miquella needed. The first was entry to the land of shadow. Mog's rituals, draining his own life and the blood of others, were the mechanism by which Miquella's body was prepared and positioned for the journey to the realm of shadow. The second was the body itself. Miquella wanted Mog to die where he did, so that Mog's corpse would be dragged into the realm of shadow, conveniently stored for the next stage of the plan. When the Tarnished killed Mog in the base game, defeating the Lord of Blood in his dynasty's mausoleum, they were unknowingly serving Miquella's plan. Mog's death was necessary. His corpse was needed. And once Mog was dead, his body was taken into the land of shadow to become the vessel for Radahn's soul. The tragedy of Mog is one of the cruelest in the DLC. He was discarded by his parents for being an omen, cast into the sewers, rejected from the beginning. He clawed his way to power and dreamed of raising his beloved Miquella as a god with himself at the side of the new order. And he was discarded again by the very brother he was devoted to, used as a charmed pawn and then as a corpse, his body stuffed with another brother's soul to serve a plan he had never been a real part of. Discarded by his parents for what he was, discarded by Miquella for what his body could hold. Mog's devotion was real, and it was used, and he died never knowing he had been a tool from the start. The resurrection. In the land of shadow, Miquella's plan reached its culmination. Having divested himself of his flesh to prepare for his ascension through the gate of divinity, the same gate Marika had once used to become a god, Miquella took Mog's corpse and made it the vessel for Radahn's soul. The being that resulted was promised Consort Radahn. Radahn's soul, drawn from wherever the festival's death had sent it, infused into Mog's body, reborn at his prime, the rot gone, the strength restored, the general at the height of his power once more. But the body was Mog's, and the marks of Mog remained. The horns of the omen came out of Radahn's gauntlets. The blood flame of Mog, the Lord of Blood's fire, was available to the resurrected general. Radahn, consort of Miquella, fought with his own gravity magic and his own enormous blades, and also with the blood flame of the brother whose body he now wore. This is the final boss of the shadow of the Erdtree, and it is, for many who reached it, one of the hardest fights From Software has ever made. The first phase is promised Consort Radahn, the general reborn in Mohg's body, wielding gravity and blade and blood flame. Then Miquella joins. Once a portion of the boss's health is taken, Miquella descends and merges with the battle, and the fight becomes Radahn, consort of Miquella, the strong brother and the divine brother, fighting together as the consort pairing the vow had promised. The strength of Radahn joined to the divinity of Miquella, just as the childhood vow had described. The Lord and the God fighting as one, the gentler world they meant to build defended by the combined power of the strongest demigod and the would-be god of compassion, Feanins, Ansbach, and the truth revealed. The plan was uncovered within the story, largely through Sir Ansbach. He had been a servant of Mohg, one of the Lord of Blood's followers, and his quest line in the DLC is the thread through which the manipulation of Mohg is revealed. Ansbach comes to understand that his master had been charmed, that Mohg had been a pawn from the beginning, that the dynasty Mohg dreamed of had never been real, because Mohg's every act had served Miquella rather than himself. The realization is bitter for Ansbach, who had been loyal to Mohg, and it is through his investigation and his dialogue that the player assembles the picture of what Miquella did. The charmed abduction, the rituals that served Miquella's entry to the land of shadow, the body preserved for Radahn's soul. Ansbach is the witness who pieces it together, the loyal servant of the discarded brother who learns how thoroughly his master had been used. Freya too speaks of the vow. The Redmane who had been charmed by Miquella after Aeonia, who had followed him into the land of shadow, carries knowledge of the consort vow and speaks of it across the DLC. Her presence ties the threads together. A Redmane who had served Radahn, charmed away by Miquella, now in the land of shadow as the plan to resurrect Radahn as Miquella's consort reaches its end. The general's own knight, taken by the same charm that may have taken the general, present for the resurrection of the Lord she once served into the service of the god who took her. Between Ansbach and Freya, the story of the vow and the plan is assembled. Mohg's servant and Radahn's knight, both touched by Miquella's design, both witnesses to the convergence of the scheme in the land of shadow. What Miquella wanted. It is worth pausing on Miquella's purpose, because it complicates any simple reading of him as a villain who used his brothers. Miquella sought to ascend to godhood through the gate of divinity and bring forth the age of compassion, a gentler world to replace the cruel order that Marika had built. His dream was not malice. It was a kinder world, an order founded on compassion rather than the golden cruelty that had cast out omens and cursed his sister and afflicted him. To build this gentler world, Miquella divested himself of his flesh, abandoned his power, gave up piece after piece of himself, laying crosses across the land of shadow that mark what he abandoned in pursuit of his goal. He sacrificed an enormous amount, his flesh, his power, and in the act of divesting himself of what he was to prepare for ascension, he lost himself and what he once was. The Miquella who reaches the gate of divinity is not the Miquella who began the journey. He gave up so much of himself in pursuit of the gentle world that he may have given up the very compassion that motivated the goal, becoming something that pursues the age of compassion through means that are not themselves compassionate. The charming of wills, the use of brothers, the puppet consort. This is the irony at the heart of Miquella's design. He wanted a gentler world, and to build it he charmed and used and discarded the people around him, including the brother he admired for his kindness. The age of compassion was to be built on the controlled will of a charmed consort and the corpse of a discarded brother. The dream was gentle, the means were not, and Radahn, the strong and kind brother whose qualities Miquella had admired since childhood, was at the center of the contradiction. Resurrected to anchor a gentle world, possibly stripped of his own will to serve it, the kindness that Miquella loved him for perhaps overwritten by the charm that made him a consort. What Radahn was in this. The most haunting detail of the resurrected Radahn is that he does not speak. Throughout the final battle, the only one talking is Miquella. Radahn, who had been so beloved and so noble, who had been admired for his qualities, says nothing. His idol Godfrey had spoken during his own fight. The other demigods had dialogue, cinematic introductions, words that established who they were and why they fought. Promised consort Radahn is silent, and Miquella speaks for him, and the silence raises the question that the DLC does not answer outright. Is Radahn there at all? The silence, combined with the knowledge that Miquella charms everyone around him, that his charm sways people to his will, points toward an unsettling possibility that the Radahn fighting in the land of shadow is not acting of his own will, but is under Miquella's charm, controlled by the brother who resurrected him, a puppet wearing the body of one brother and the soul of another, animated by the will of the god who needed a consort. The lore leaves this open. Radahn did promise to be Miquella's consort in their youth, and the resurrected general may be fulfilling that vow of his own accord. Or the charm that took Freya and Mog and so many others may have taken Radahn too, and the silent general may be a thing controlled rather than a person choosing. The silence is the ambiguity. The strongest demigod, reborn at his prime, fighting at the side of the god he promised to serve, and not a single word to tell us whether he chose to be there. This is the final cruelty of Radahn's arc, if the darker reading is true. He was strong, and his strength made him a target. He was kind, and his degradation was pitiable. He was honourable, and he was denied an honourable death. And now, resurrected, he may not even be himself, may be a charmed puppet in a brother's stolen body, fighting for a vow he made as a child, silent while the god who controls him speaks. The general who was so beloved for who he was may have ended as a thing that is barely anyone at all, the body of one brother, the soul of another, the will of a third, and Radahn himself somewhere beneath it all, silent. Sleep well. Tomorrow the final part, where we gather what Radahn's whole story means, and what it says to be the strongest and the kindest, and still the instrument of everyone else's design. Welcome back. This is the final part. Let everything slow. We have followed Radahn from his birth to 2 great lineages, through the study in Sellia, and the magic learned for a scrawny horse, through the conquest of the stars and the freezing of fate, through the army that loved him and the oath he swore, through the battle that poisoned him and the rot that ate his mind, through the festival that freed him and the vow that called him back, the Red Lion General, the Starscourge, the strongest demigod, the promised consort. Now we sit with what all of it means. The strongest and the kindest. 2 qualities define Radahn across every part of his story, and they are the 2 that Miquella named when he chose Radahn for his consort. Strength and kindness. The strength is obvious. Radahn was the mightiest hero of the demigods, the strongest in the Shattering War, the warrior who conquered the stars and whose army knew no weakness. No one could beat him in open battle. The strength is the thing the legend remembers, the thing the song sang, the foundation of his place at the top of the martial hierarchy of the lands between. The kindness is the thing that makes his story matter rather than merely impress. Radahn was kind. He was a caring leader to his army, beloved by his soldiers, admired for his noble qualities. He learned a school of magic so that he would not have to abandon his horse. He recruited warriors whose valor he admired and treated them as people worth valuing. He swore an oath of honourable death with a friend. The kindness ran through everything, the gentle counterpart to the terrible strength, the quality that made the Red Lion General beloved rather than merely feared. The combination is rare, and it is the heart of who Radahn was. Strength without kindness is tyranny. Kindness without strength is ineffectual. Radahn was both at the highest level, the strongest warrior who was also the kindest lord, and the combination is what made him admired, what made Miquella want him, what made his fate so tragic. The most powerful being was also one of the most decent, and the world destroyed him anyway. The instrument of others' fates. Here is the cruelty that runs through Radahn's whole story. The strongest demigod, the being no one could defeat, spent his existence as the instrument of other people's designs. Consider how little of Radahn's story is about Radahn's own goals. He conquered the stars, and the conquest became the obstacle to Ranni's fate, an obstacle that defined his significance to her plans. He was poisoned by Malenia, who fought him as Miquella's blade, possibly as a step in Miquella's plan. He was killed at the festival, which freed his friend's oath and released Ranni's fate, and opened Nokron for the Tarnished's progression toward the Age of Stars. He was resurrected by Miquella to serve as a consort in a plan made when they were children. At every turn, Radahn's significance is defined by what he means to someone else's plan. To Ranni, he is the obstacle whose death she needs. To Malenia, he is the consort she must dishonor to fulfill her brother's design. To Jeren, he is the friend whose death the oath requires. To Miquella, he is the lord whose strength and kindness will anchor the age of compassion. To the Tarnished, he is the boss whose defeat opens the path forward. Radahn is, throughout, the thing that other people need to die, or to live, or to serve, for their own purposes. What did Radahn want? The lore gives us very little. He wanted to keep his horse in his youth. He wanted to protect his lands when he conquered the stars. He wanted an honourable death when the rot had reduced him. He made a vow to his brother as a child. Beyond these, Radahn's own desires are nearly absent from his story. He is acted upon more than he acts. The strongest being in the lands between is, in narrative terms, one of the most passive, his power making him valuable to everyone else's plans and his own wishes barely registering in the machinery of fate that uses him. This is the deepest tragedy of Radahn, deeper than the rot or the degradation or the silence of the resurrected consort. The strongest demigod never got to be the author of his own story. His strength made him an instrument. His kindness made him a willing one. And the beings around him, the sister and the siblings, and the friend and the would-be god, used the instrument for their own designs, until the question of what Radahn himself wanted became almost unanswerable. The conquest that bound him. There is a particular irony in the conquest of the stars, the feat that defined Radahn, that is worth drawing out in this final reckoning. Radahn conquered the stars to protect his lands. It was, in its origin, an act of the same kindness that had made him learn gravity for his horse, a protective act, a defense of his people against the threat from above. The strongest demigod used his strength to shield Caelid from the falling stars, and the shield held, and the stars froze, and Caelid was safe. But the conquest bound him to a fate he did not choose. By freezing the stars, Radahn became the force that repulsed them, the obstacle to Ranni's destiny, the being whose death the cosmos required to resume its course. His protective act made him the thing that had to die for the future to proceed. The kindness that motivated the conquest became the mechanism of his doom. Because he held the stars, he had to be killed. Because he had to be killed, the festival was needed. Because the festival could not finish him cleanly, he wandered the dunes as a husk. And through it all, the conquest that had been an act of protection had become the chain that bound him to a death the world needed. Even his greatest feat, his most defining achievement, the conquest that gave him his name, was turned against him. He froze the stars to protect his home, and the frozen stars became the reason he had to die. There is no part of Radahn's story where his strength or his kindness works out for him. Every virtue, every achievement, every act of protection becomes, through the machinery of fate, a source of his suffering or an instrument of others' designs. The question of the festival. There is a debate among those who study Radahn's story that touches the heart of what his arc means, and it concerns the festival and the death it gave him. Jeren hosted the festival to free Radahn from the degradation of the rot, to give him the honourable death the oath required. This is presented as a mercy, and it is. But Freya, in the DLC, offers a different perspective. She says that war had always suited General Radahn best, more than any honourable death. That endless war to invigorate the soul befits the great lion. From this view, Radahn's resurrection to fight again, even as a possibly charmed consort, is not a violation, but a return to what Radahn was. A warrior whose soul was suited to endless battle, brought back to the fighting that was his nature. The two views sit in tension. Jeren saw the rot husk as a degradation to be mercifully ended. Freya saw the warrior's soul as something that belonged in endless war. Was the festival a mercy that freed Radahn? Or was Radahn's nature such that the resurrection to fight again was the truer fulfillment of who he was? Did Radahn want rest, or did he want war? The lore does not resolve this, and the lack of resolution is part of the point. We do not know what Radahn wanted, because Radahn's wants are the thing his story consistently withholds. Jeren projected onto him the desire for an honourable death. Freya projected onto him the love of endless war. Miquella projected onto him the role of consort. Each of them saw in Radahn the thing their own design required him to be, and the silent general, mindless in the dunes or wordless in the land of shadow, never told any of them what he wanted. Radahn among the demigods. It is worth placing Radahn alongside his siblings one last time, because his story illuminates theirs, and theirs illuminate his. Each of Marika's children carried a tragedy, and the tragedies rhyme. Godwyn died first, killed in a way that left his soul dead, but his body living. The inverse of Radahn's rot, which left his body strong, but his mind dead. Morgoth guarded a capital and an order that despised him for the omen horns he bore, loyal to the very thing that cursed him. Morg was discarded for those same horns, and clawed toward a power that turned out to serve a brother, used him. Malenia carried a rot that made her a weapon against her will, undefeated and yet the instrument of catastrophe. Miquella, cursed to remain a child, gave up everything he was in pursuit of a gentle world, and may have lost the gentleness in the giving. Ranni schemed her way toward a fate that required her brother's death. Radahn's tragedy fits among these, and it has its own particular shape, where Morgoth's tragedy was loyalty to what cursed him, and Mog's was devotion that was used, and Malenia's was a curse that made her a weapon. Radahn's was that his strength and kindness made him the perfect instrument. He was not cursed in his body like Malenia or Mog, not trapped in loyalty like Morgoth, not scheming like Ranni. He was the strongest and the kindest. Nothing more complicated than that, and that combination, in the world of the lands between, was enough to make him the thing everyone else's plans were built around. The demigods are a family of tragedies, and the family resemblance is that none of them got the thing they were. Godwyn the Golden, the beloved firstborn, became the corpse god of the death root. Miquella the kind became the charming manipulator. Malenia the undefeated became the bringer of rot. And Radahn the strong and kind became the husk and the puppet. His virtues turned to others' uses. The Shattering did not only break the Elden Ring, it broke every one of Marika's children, each in the way that their particular nature made them most vulnerable to being broken. The legend that outlived the man. There is one more thing to sit with before we close, and it is the way Radahn's legend persisted independent of what happened to the man. Across the lands between, Radahn is remembered as the mightiest hero, the conqueror of stars, the strongest of the demigods. The songs that were sung about him were songs of the conquest, of the warrior who confronted the falling stars alone and crushed them. This legend was true when it was made, and it persisted in the telling even as the man it described was reduced to a husk in the dunes. The people who sang of Radahn the Star Conqueror were singing of a being who, by the time of the singing, no longer existed in any meaningful sense, replaced by a mindless beast that wore his body. This gap between the legend and the man is its own kind of tragedy. Radahn the legend was strength and glory, and the conquest of the heavens. Radahn the man, by the end, was a husk eating corpses in a rotted wasteland, then a silent puppet in a stolen body. The legend stayed bright while the man decayed, and the brightness of the legend made the decay of the man more terrible by contrast. To have been so great in song and so ruined in fact is a particular cruelty. The legend a monument to a glory that the rot had eaten away while the songs continued. When the tarnished faces Radahn in the wailing dunes or in the land of shadow, they face the gap. They face a legend that the lore has built up as the mightiest hero, and they encounter a husk or a puppet that bears almost no relation to the noble general the songs describe. The fight is, in both cases, a meeting with what is left of a legend after the world has finished using the man the legend was about. The strongest and the kindest, remembered in song, encountered as a ruin, and still, beneath the ruin, the legend holds something true. Radahn was the mightiest hero. He did conquer the stars. He was strong and kind. The legend was not a lie, even after the man it described was gone. It was a true account of what Radahn had been, preserved in song, while the being it described was unmade. The legend is the last thing that remembers Radahn as he was, the strong and kind general, before the rot and the vow and the uses others made of him. The songs remember the man the world destroyed, what his story says. The story of Radahn is the story of what it means to be the strongest and the kindest and still be used. It is a story that resists the simple shape we expect from the strongest character in a world. We expect the strongest to be the author of events, the one whose power lets him pursue his own designs, the mover rather than the moved. Radahn is the opposite. His strength makes him valuable to everyone else's designs. and his kindness makes him serve them, and his story is the story of a powerful being whose power and decency together make him the perfect instrument for other people's purposes. There is something to sit within this, something that the slow pace of sleep is suited to holding. The world does not reward strength and kindness with agency. Radahn had both in the highest measure, and he ended as a husk in the dunes and a silent puppet in the land of shadow. His every virtue converted into a use that others made of him. The strongest demigod was the least free. The kindest lord was the most exploited. The being who could not be defeated in battle was defeated by everything except battle, by rot, by fate, by oaths and vows, and the designs of those who needed him to be the thing their plans required. And yet the story is not only sad. There is the horse. Before the stars and the war and the rot and the vow, there was a giant who loved a scrawny horse too much to leave it behind, and who learned to bend gravity itself rather than abandon something small that he loved. That is the truest image of Radahn, the one beneath all the uses others made of him. Not the conqueror of stars, not the strongest demigod, not the promised consort, but the kind giant who would not give up his horse, the strength and the kindness in their purest form, before the world turned them into instruments. A warrior learning gentleness's hardest lesson, that you bend the cosmos rather than abandon what you love. The stars are moving again now. Radahn's grip on them is gone, released in the dunes, and the sky turns the way it was meant to turn. Somewhere in the story, beneath the legend and the rot and the vow, a giant rides a small horse across a green land that has not yet rotted, holding the stars at bay so his people can sleep, and not yet knowing that the holding will cost him everything. This has been the entire timeline of Starscourge Radahn, from the champion's cub to the lord of the battlefield's lion, from the magic learned for a horse to the conquest of the stars, from the festival that freed him to the vow that bound him beyond death, the strongest and the kindest, and the instrument of every design but his own, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my dear friend.